The Game Boy Advance had a really healthy collection of launch titles when compared to both the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. Depending on the region, you'd have an awesome choice of at least 15 titles for the new portable. Japan actually had well over 20 to pick from. So much so, it's actually quite the pickle for me to know in what order to tackle these reviews. Like always, I'm going to go chronologically, but the date of March 21st, 2001 saw so many different releases that it's hard to know what order to look at them in. I could do it alphabetically, but that's kinda boring, and I really don't want to start this brand new series off by reviewing Boku wa Koku Kanseikan, a game in the Airport Hero franchise where you basically play as an air traffic controller operating out of a Japanese airport. Of course, I will look at that at some point, but honestly, some of the other launchers are such strong games that it'd be doing them a disservice to leave them till later. So, to that end, I'm gonna tackle these initial games simply in the order I'm most excited by. For those of you who've checked out last week's Top 10 GBA games I pulled out of my ass video, you'll perhaps have spotted there was only one launch title in that list, so it makes all the sense in the world to dive right into that one. As for the rest, I'll have to come up with a decent order that doesn't leave us with 10 weeks of mediocrity after all the good ones have gone. Now then, Castlevania. Where the heck do you even start with this? If the original Game Boy trilogy of Vania titles were strong, I even like Legends to a certain extent despite its flaws, the Advance Collection is a whole other level. This coming from a guy who gave Belmont's Revenge 7 stars out of 5, breaking my whole rating system in the process. Now, we hear the term Metroidvania all the time these days. It's become a genre all of its own and refers, if you don't know, to these action platformers that really embrace exploration, semi-linearity, puzzle solving and so on over just a straight run and jumper. There's often, as well, a real leaning to this RPG side of things, definitely evident in Castlevania games, with stats and leveling up systems, monster bestiaries, upgradable weapons and armor, all that sort of thing. We joined the Castlevania story in 1830, placing the first Game Boy Advance chapter around 2.5 centuries after the two non-retcon Game Boy titles, but more crucially, only a few decades after Symphony of the Night, the first notable entry with this Metroidvania gameplay style. Note that this isn't a Belmont title. The timeline tells that the legendary family of vampire killers mysteriously went missing during the 1800s, demanding stand-ins from various organizations to keep at bay the onslaughts of various power-mad lunatics determined to revive the Lord of Darkness for their own aims. During this time, we'd see the Order of Ecclesia and their Dominus bearer Shanoa, as well as more prominently the Belmont's distant cousins, the Morrises. Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis featured one John Morris and his best friend Eric Lecard, and John's son Jonathan would take up the whip in 1944 in Portrait of Ruin. Before this family, and even earlier than Quincy Morris, there was a veteran vampire hunter by the name of Morris Baldwin, not confusing at all, and his son Hugh. Master Baldwin had another apprentice as well as his son, one Nathan Graves, who is the protagonist we're following in Circle of the Moon. Oft confusing as the timeline can be, ultimately the fundamentals of each entry in the Vania series remain the same. As if nobody in this universe ever picked up a history book before, Count Dracula has again been resurrected. The three vampire hunters are lured to a castle in Austria belonging to a vampire called Camilla, where Dracula's remains are being housed. They make their way to the throne room just in time to witness Vlad's resurrection. He's not at his full power yet though, but Camilla has a plan to remedy this by sacrificing Master Baldwin during a lunar eclipse of the full moon. Hugh and Nathan are unceremoniously disposed of, being cast deep down into the bowels of the castle, and have to work their way back through, taking down a whole bestiary of demonic minions, including the Necromancer and even Camilla herself. Lots of Metroidvanias allow the use of many different weapons, from swords to lances and even firearms sometimes. Here, however, you're equipped solely with the whip. But that's not to say your combat options are limited, far from it. You'll get a choice of 5 sub-weapons that'll be found by whipping candles in the time-honored fashion, and they all have their own strengths. You get the arcing axe, the boomeranging cross, holy water that can generate fire on the ground, a fast-flying dagger, and even a stopwatch that can stop time temporarily. As normal, their ammo is dictated by the hearts that you pick up, displayed under your health bar at the top of the screen. However, you might also notice a blue gauge under the red one. This relates to the more interesting part of the combat scheme. Unique to Circle of the Moon is this DSS, a dual setup system based on magic cards found throughout the game. These cards belong to one of two categories: action cards and attribute cards, and there are 10 of each to find, dropped by defeated enemies on a luck-based system. The action cards are named for a Roman deity like Mercury or Jupiter. They have a certain area that they affect. Mercury will enhance the whip, Venus changes stats, Neptune is to do with recovery, and so on. The attribute cards, named after mythical creatures from Roman and Greek myth, work simultaneously to produce an elemental effect that goes alongside the actions. For instance, Salamander is your fire elemental, Manticore does things relating to poison, and so on. Being 10 of each, you can combine any of the action and attribute cards to give a total of 100 different skills you can spend that MP gauge on. Equipping Mercury and Salamander, then activating DSS in-game by pressing the L trigger, turns your whip into a fire whip, increasing strength by 5%. Equipping Cockatrice instead of Salamander augments the whip by 10% and adds the possibility of turning enemies into stone. Others do fancier stuff than just altering your whip though. Having Jupiter and Thunderbird activated will reduce all damage received by half. Very useful, but it uses up your MP over time rather than upon attack, and so is not infinite. Alternately, other weapons can also be hidden in these cards. Mars plus Black Dog actually lets you attack with a gun. Swapping Poochie for a unicorn grants you a holy sword. Many different things to discover, ensuring you're not confined to a rudimentary attack scheme by any means. Nathan's stats are quite standard for RPGs. His HP and MP, physical attack and defense, magical strength, intelligence, which governs the speed of MP regeneration, and of course luck, the frequency that things are dropped by enemies. These can all be augmented by equipping items and equipment, as well as by leveling up. Each enemy grants you a certain amount of experience when defeated, and they'll regenerate infinitely by simply leaving and re-entering a room, meaning you can grind as much or as little as you want to get past that devilishly tricky boss. These boss fights are immense, 10 unique, epic battles against all sorts of horrible foes with really inventive patterns and weak spots. They're spread very widely across the castle and can take an age to find. A good thing, I assure you, and hidden behind these glowing blue doors. There'll typically be a save room nearby, although later on you'll probably have 2 or 3 standard rooms to battle through between one and the other, meaning you'll need to be careful on your way, else start fights with reduced HP. The controls are quite intuitive for the most part, and reveal themselves to you the further you progress. At first you might wonder why Nathan moves so slowly, although anyone who's played the Game Boy games will be used to this, of course. You have to find these dash boots that grant you the ability to run by double tapping. A little worrying that a prospective vampire killer doesn't yet know how to run, but perhaps there's some weird dark magic going on in this castle. You'll also eventually augment your skill set with a double jump. A shoulder tackle lets you break blocks, a wall jump, all sorts of standard Metroidvania barriers that you expect to come across. Typically, chunks of the game are locked behind having these mechanisms in place. If you find a particularly high ledge or corridor blocked by an obstruction, make note of where it is on the map and come back to it later when you've found the needed power-up. As modern games of this genre go, there are perhaps not all that many, but in 2001 the style was still kind of finding its feet a little bit, now that contemporary consoles could handle the map sizes and so on. Super Metroid was kind of the exception rather than the rule. It'll take a smarter guy than me to explain how they managed to get that game to work on a SNES, and suffice to say, it's pretty impressive. While the graphics aren't quite as impressive perhaps as the other 2 Castlevanias would get on the GBA, I must remind myself of my policy to never retroactively review qualities like that in games, and note that it was a colossal step up from anything on the original Game Boy. You're always going to get things like this early on in a system's lifespan, where the programming tips and tricks had not all been worked out yet, and developers err on the side of functionality rather than immediate mind-blowing visuals. Having said that, the atmosphere generated by the settings is still phenomenal. The monsters beautifully and horrifyingly detailed as much as you could expect. It's a shame about how dark the original GBA is, because a lot of this might have been missed. And to this day, I rarely play games on one of those horizontal OG advances, where the SPs with their illuminated screens are just so much better, or even an original DS which had a slot for Game Boy Advance cartridges. Almost without exception, Castlevania games have stunning soundtracks. and Circle is right up there with the best. Fidelity might be a bit rough in places, but there's almost no trace of a chiptune here, instead using properly rendered sounds that cause the tracks to come alive in a way that I distinctly remember being delighted by as a teenager when I first got my GBA way back when. I'd never heard anything like this outside of an actual console, and that's not even to touch on the compositional quality, which is off the charts. No Michiru Yamane on this one, but the trio of Satoru Tajima, Hiroshi Mitsuoka, and Taro Kudo are more than suitable to handle it. Pure, progressive rock opera greatness with crazy time signature choices that go way above and beyond what is strictly needed, providing atmosphere through the levels and a freneticism needed when in boss fights. We could go on and on with this debut Game Boy Advance review, but I'm well aware of the size of this library. It's larger still than the original Game Boy's was. So let's draw a line underneath Circle of the Moon. What a hell of a benchmark to set though. The near 1,500 other titles have a mammoth task to come close to how impressive this is. I know of some games that managed it. Good luck to the rest of you, that's all I'll say.